Professor Segrist. We just finished a video on just war, and I left off right before I was gonna sort of give an overview uh, of the threefold framework of of just war theory: jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. And I'm going to go in the order that Walzer takes them in his book, implicitly at least, um, in terms of first jus ad bellum, justice in going to war, just cause, and jus post bellum, justice in concluding a war and in dealing with the defeated power, right? And then, so I'll cover those two in this video, and then do jus ad bellum, jus in bello during wartime, just conduct during the war, um, in a third video, especially as Walzer spends more time on that. So, jus ad bellum. Let me, I mean, first of all, the idea is that there's got to be a just cause, right? And there's one easy one for just cause, that is self-defense. Self-defense is always permissible in just war theory. There may be a question about whether you need to go to war, whether you really are under threat of imminent attack or whatever, but just as a basic principle, self-defense is always justifiable. Right. There's also an easy case for when war is always impermissible, and that is when it's a drive for conquest, for plunder, or glory, right? Those are not sufficient reasons. They're not even morally sound reasons to go to war. So that's a pretty easy case as well. The harder cases, Walzer takes up in terms of preemption, prevention, and intervention. Or at least that's the way I'm going to label them. Goes with what he said, but let's take up preemption first. This is, of the more difficult cases, this is the easiest. It's generally agreed that it's acceptable to launch a first strike in the face of an imminent threat if you know that an army is going to attack you, if you have very good evidence. They're massing troops on your border, right? Maybe they haven't told you they're going to attack. Maybe they haven't officially declared war, but it's pretty clear that you're going to be attacked anytime now. According to just war principles, it's justified to strike first. You don't have to wait until they blow up a big portion of your population to be justified in hitting them, right? A much more problematic reason is preventive war. And this is generally held to be impermissible. Right? The idea that you're responding to a gathering threat as opposed to an imminent threat. Imminent threat means they're about to attack. Right? Gathering threat means you're worried about the trajectory of their behavior, right? And the gathering threat is more problematic. Prevention against the gathering threat is more problematic because it's less obviously necessary, right, in relation to legitimate aims of war. And necessity is sort of a sine qua non of going to war, right? So take an ancient example here, Sparta, Peloponnesian War. Right? Sparta started it, and well, it's complicated, right? But Sparta actually initiates what you might call formal war with Athens, in anticipation of the Athenian Empire establishing a an unchecked tyranny, solidifying their grip on tyranny. Um, this was a preventive war, right? Um, it's also not entirely easy case. Um, compare, for example, to the American Revolution. American Revolution is a war, right? And we generally think of it, we Americans certainly, as a just war. This is certainly, uh, certainly the British took issue with that suggestion at the time, and some people still do. Some people will suggest that the American Revolution was not a just war, um, although that's not the prevailing view. When you think about the American Revolution, um, they 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 American Revolution is complicated because we didn't take arms until they shot first. So, but certainly in the Declaration of Independence, the justification for revolution is not that a tyranny has already been established. It is that there has been a long train of abuses suggesting a trajectory towards tyranny, right? Towards the establishment, a firm establishment of tyranny. And it's critical in, it's clearly suggested that it's critical to act before the tyranny is already established, right? Um, so, I, in some ways, I mean, clearly the British, did some things, uh, maybe like the Boston Massacre, it was not planned, and so forth. Um, you had increasingly harsh measures, the blockading of the port of Boston, right, and establishment of martial law in Boston, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the principle here, the principle of revolution would seem to perhaps call into question the idea that preventive war is never just. Um, just leave that for you to think about. A very interesting modern case, of course, is the Iraq War, 2003 Iraq War, U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it was defended explicitly as a preventive war. I mean, George W. Bush was very clear. He didn't make any bones about it that the general standard was preemption. That is, there's an imminent threat. But because we thought he had weapons of mass destruction, because he was a hostile power to the U.S., because he seemed like he had ties with terrorism, though less clearly with Al Qaeda, and he seemed to be the kind of enemy that would be more than willing to provide his weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. The whole idea was, I mean, and Bush used the term, it's a gathering threat. And though preemption was historically the right standard, he said, we live in a new situation. The situation is such that by the time we wait for a threat of being hit by weapons of mass destruction, by the time it's imminent, it's too late. If you're dealing with terrorists, if you're dealing with people you can't recognize as part of an army, these are non-state actors, etc. They may be supported by states in some ways, and that was his justification for preventive warfare, right? And this claim was debatable. Certainly, it was debatable whether it was really necessary to do this war. It's debatable whether the whether Saddam really was on a trajectory to go to war or to support war against the United States and so on. But at least to Bush's credit, you have to say that he was honest and straightforward about it, and he did try to give a moral rationale. Um, it's also notable with regard to the Iraq War, by the way. This was not the only justification, and for a complete accounting of whether the Iraq War can be conceived as a just war, um, it has to take these other things into account. There were three justifications. One is preventive war, the most controversial aspect of it. Excuse me. The second one was law enforcement. The UN had, over the course of 12 years, passed 17 UN resolutions demanding that Saddam Hussein comply with the weapons, uh, the weapons inspections from international weapons inspectors to make sure he was complying with the terms of the peace in the 1991 Iraq War, the so-called Gulf War, right? The terms of the peace of that war were that Saddam would allow inspection of weapons of mass destruction. And so part of Bush's defense, and some people think he should have made it more central to his defense, was that it was clearly Iraq was clearly in violation of a long pattern of violations of international law, serious violation of international law, and suggested that if we're not going to ever pull the trigger on these things, then what's the point, right? That was part of the idea. And the third was humanitarian. There was no question that Saddam's regime was one of the most brutal on the planet. If you want to read about it, you can read, there's an Iraqi named Kenan Makia, Mekiya, called The Republic of Fear. And it was about Saddam's regime, and it kind of catalogs the atrocities that Saddam routinely committed against his own population, right? Not the least of which was gassing, I believe it was the Kurds in the south, using chemical weapons against them, right? But in any case, so the Iraq War, will be the subject of just war reflection for a long time to come. One point that might be worth making about that is that it does seem, at least it's logically possible, that a war could have just cause but be imprudent, too risky, too much likely cost. I mean, that prudence does have a moral dimension there, but it could be possible that a war have a good, strong case in terms of having a just cause, but that it would still be imprudent, and that's worth keeping in mind. I mean, conceivably, one could say that Bush did everything he was supposed to do in terms of just war reasoning, but he failed at a couple of crucial points, most notably what to do after the fighting stopped. And in that case, you could say, well, even if he did due diligence in terms of trying to establish a just cause, he failed to do due diligence in terms of preparing for a just peace, the post jus post bellum. Right? In any case, it's also a case of intervention, right? In the case of the Iraq War, but on intervention, let me just note Walter's basic guidelines and point out some difficulties and point out a couple of cases that he either mentions and doesn't perhaps sufficiently elaborate or leaves out because he wrote this before they happened. First of all, guidelines for intervention. Walzer says there must the principle of self-determination, self-help. Those principles are critical. Right? The people to be helped must seek help. To help people who have not asked for help or maybe don't want help is problematic. Let's say it's not a good reason. They must choose their own fates, right? They must be trying to help themselves out of this situation. You cannot unilaterally, without dare say so, do it yourself, right? And then the second criterion regarding intervention is counter interventions. If you're trying to prevent other nations from exploiting the situation, right? Who would pose a serious threat to your nation or to the international order. That's another thing about the Iraq War, by the way. Part of the rationale was that, and this was explicit in the Gulf War, in the first one, in 1991. George H.W. Bush articulated this. He wasn't a terribly articulate guy, but this was the principles he was going on was that it was necessary to push Saddam back out of Kuwait, which he had invaded, because the international state system was based on, not having nations conquer other nations, right? And you couldn't just let nations conquer other nations without some kind of resistance, right? So the protection of the international state system, and this somewhat played into George W. Bush's rationale regarding the Iraq War, is that this is a rogue state who is severely upsetting the international order. So, for what it's worth. Some difficulties about intervention, I think, and this is just my take on it. First problem is the difficulty often of discerning the good guys from the bad guys, right? If there are any good guys, right? A lot of nations, this kind of relates to the counter interventions thing, really abide by the old Arab proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So maybe you'd be willing to support unsavory characters if they are fighting your enemy, right? And George W. Bush actually explicitly rejected this rationale. He said that we've been propping up tyrannies and it's come back to bite us. So we now realize that tyranny is inherently a danger to us all, as breeding grounds for terror, as upsetters of international order, etc. But discerning good guys from bad guys. And then secondly, the thing I would stress is the difficulty of assessing probable consequences. And even if it's clear who the good guys are, and perhaps even if the good guys meet those criteria of self-determination and self-help, there is still a question of, when we enter the picture, if we intervene into this situation, what are going to be effects of that on the population and on the international order as well? And this is hard to do. And again, if one of the lessons of the Iraq War might be, we need to think harder about consequences of actions than we do about long-term implications, unintended consequences, right? So let me just mention 3 quick cases here. First of all, Walter takes up the Vietnam War. Walter had been a protester of the Vietnam War. He says this in the beginning of his, um, I guess it's his original preface. Although he thinks that he is much more sophisticated now than he was then. But one of the curious things missing in his account here of Vietnam in terms of U.S. intervention, I mean, he criticizes it because, well, it's not clear that there was a movement for self-determination and self-help. It was messy in terms of where the population, who the population sided with, and so forth. But one of the strange lacunas, what he left out, was that central to U.S. Strategic thinking about Vietnam was the policy of containment, right? The policy of containment established by George Kennan in his famous long telegram, on the sources of Soviet conduct. It recommended this policy of trying to contain that the idea is that the Soviet Union was an aggressive, expansive power, and but we have to be very cautious with them. He laid out the way they think, and based on the way they think and the way they operate, he came up with this policy of containment, which, as you know, is pushing back wherever the Soviets pushed out, right? I don't think you can understand Vietnam without taking that into consideration, and without considering whether that is, in fact, might be a legitimate cause for war, leaving aside the mess it was, leaving aside whether it was winnable, leaving aside whether we could have conducted the war better, both militarily and in moral terms. Would it be an acceptable reason to intervene if you think the Soviet Union represents an existential threat to the U.S. and to Western order, right, to Western civilization? It may be that that's not enough, but it seems like, in my mind, it's something that Walter really should have taken up, and it seems almost inexcusable that he doesn't. Two other cases since the time that Walter wrote the book. One, the Syrian Civil War in recent years, right, out of which came ISIS, right, the Islamic State. Here's a case where you have lots of bad guys, and it's really hard to sort out who the good guys are. The regime is bad. Many of the many of the groups involved in this fight were terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda offshoots, which is what ISIS was. But you also had this scenario of Russian intervention, right? So, what about a counter intervention here? Would that have been a good justification? Again, it's a scenario where the consequences are very unpredictable about getting involved. So, those points to think about. And then there was Egypt and Libya. All this happening under the Obama administration, of course, these examples. But Egypt and Libya seemed that we had a similar motivation, but opposite actions related to those motivations. In both cases, it seemed like the basic idea was to rid the regimes of tyrants, right, or dictators, or what have you. Right. In the case of Egypt, it was non-intervention, and in the case of Libya, it was intervention under the new category, the new idea of a duty to protect the innocent, to intervene for humanitarian purposes, and this was part of the thinking with Libya. In the case of Egypt, I'm drawing a blank on his name at the moment, but um, the president of Egypt, premier, I can't remember what you call it, but he kept calling the Obama administration, and they refused to answer. They would basically not give him any answer. He was begging for their help. Right. So this is and perhaps the Obama administration thought it was not a legitimate regime or whatever. But of course, you ended up with a guy being dragged through the streets, desecrated, and so on. And a regime change, which ended up with a temporary rule of excuse me of the Muslim Brotherhood, uh, which has ties to terrorism, which is certainly, uh, even in its more moderate branch, a version of political Islam, and and in some ways, at least comparatively speaking, fairly extreme, perhaps more dangerous than the previous guy. I can't believe I'm forgetting his name, but anyway, you know who I'm talking about. So, and in all of these cases, you could argue that it didn't turn out well. You know, part of we're in the spring fever, right? We're talk about the Arab Spring and a sort of wave of freedom over the Middle East, and that did not materialize, right, as we now know. And by the way, there was an element of non-intervention in the Syrian civil war that greatly undermined confidence in President Obama and the Obama administration among players in the Middle East, and that was his when he drew a red line and said, you know, if the if the regime, if Assad in Syria uses chemical weapons against one of these groups, that would be a red line. Would be a crime against humanity, red line, and we would implicitly we would strike them. And when time came, they actually did use chemical weapons. He thought it over and decided we're not going to do anything. And this really undermined people's confidence in him in many places around the world. Okay, so just a few more minutes in this video. A couple of comments on Jus Post Bellum, the just conclusion of a war, right, and just treatment of the defeated nation or nations, right. The legitimate aim here, the aim is, in just war theory, is always a just peace, right. And that's important to stress, just peace, because you can't have a peace that is unjust. I mean, a tyrannical regime could be at peace in the sense that there's not constant upheaval in society, but it's not a just peace. And if you are responsible for determining what's going to happen with a nation after you get out, I mean after you end the war with them, and you leave them in the hands of a tyrant, this could be problematic. So, but in any case, let me just stress 2 points about the Jus Post Bellum. First is that one legitimate aim of winning a war that is recognized in the just war tradition is deterrence against future aggression, right? It is legitimate to impose certain constraints on the nation, and these hard restraints might be necessary to prevent deterrence. It can certainly be, to provide deterrence. It can certainly be overdone. You can think of the harsh terms on Germany after World War I, and whether that did not, in fact, produce seeds for. I mean, it's generally thought that that sort of helped pave the way for Hitler. Um, so and ironically, the way this was done was for deterrence, right? To weaken them and make sure they couldn't do this kind of thing again, causing Europe-wide war. Well, that didn't work very well. So it's important to do it right, but deterrence is a critical consideration. I mean, if you if a nation surrenders to you after fighting and you bring them to a peace treaty, but there is no provision made to keep them from doing it again, it's really just a truce. It's it's arguably morally irresponsible, right? To leave them in a position where they can just do the thing again. So that's an important consideration. And secondly, the more obvious thing in moral terms is how you treat the local population. Right? And I guess one of the main considerations here, the one I want to spotlight anyway, I mean, obviously, the general violations of human rights is would be out, but one of the things that maybe is not thought of enough, and for example, in the Iraq War again, is leaving the population in a viable situation, right? If you leave a defeated power, a defeated nation, defeated government of the nation, if you will, in a situation where the lives of the population are going to be made worse, or kept as bad as they were, these are kind of the things you have to think about, in how you ended up. And this is where I mentioned earlier that Locke's provision for property rights turns out to come in pretty handy in terms of just war. If you think about Locke's chapter on conquest in the second treatise, he puts all these restrictions on what a conquering power in a just war is justified in doing with the population. And he says this sounds like a strange doctrine, but even though they can pretty much make slaves of the male population, in the sense that at least that maybe not institution of slavery, but can essentially have them all under arrest, something like that. Even though they can do that, they can't mess with the property of those people. And you're right. It seems strange. People, they can be executed, they can be detained and held indefinitely, but their property can't be messed with. And it seems backward. But Locke's rationale for that is pretty powerful, and that is that their dependents, the dependents of these men, rely on that property to survive. I mean, they need that family farm. They need, that house, etc. So if you make the property of the defeated army fair game, you undermine the population's means of support. And this is where I think, we may recognize problems with Locke's theory of property in terms of possessions, right? But one thing that does seem pretty critical is if people can't have some exclusive use of their own clothes, their own dwelling, etc., then Locke seems right that there is really no solid protection for these people. So, I mean, if you don't want to look at it in terms of land, look at it in terms of wages, right? If workers' wages can be just taken from them at will by the government, including 100% taken away from them, confiscated, then it seems like a violation of rights, doesn't it? But what would be the basis of the violation of rights? I mean, it has something to do with a right to property in that payment, right? Um, in any case, um, two things I'll mention about dealing with the local population before I end this video, and then we'll take up the jus in bello later. First has to do with humanitarian assistance. I mean, the population may be in bad straits after a war, especially if you had to invade. Um, and so there may be need for humanitarian assistance, and that may be an imperative. That may be a moral imperative, depending on how bad things are, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing, though, deals with the question of occupation, right? It may be necessary to temporarily occupy a defeated nation, right? To provide for that deterrence I was talking about, right? But there's a whole host of important moral questions that arise here. First, is occupation strictly necessary in a given scenario? For how long? Is there going to be any plan for unoccupying, getting out, or is this going to be just basically a conquest? And how are you going to rule? What role are the people going to have in ruling? Which people? Given who maybe was involved in the war, supported the war. The one of the criticisms about the handling of the Bush administration, George W. Bush, at the end of the Iraq, the fighting war, was their de-Baathification, it's like denazification, right? All of the Baath Party loyalists, purged from the government. But unfortunately, that also rid the government of all the people who had any political experience. And some of them, as was the case with many people in the Nazi regime, this is not morally justifiable, perhaps, but they were loyal party members only insofar as they needed it to keep their jobs, not because they were committed to the ideology. That doesn't absolve them of the operation they were involved with, but it does raise an important question. Government has to be provided for. You don't, and the way it was put in Colin Powell, General Powell, I'm sure you've heard of him. His basic rule was, if you break it, you fix it. Right? If you wreck a nation, you're obligated to fix it somehow. But how, right? Is nation building possible? What do you need to set up for the population after the war is over? And it's not an easy question, but at minimum, it seems like just war theory would require that you develop a plan, right? And you can think of cases where occupation was necessary and worked out well, and you can think of cases where it didn't. In the case of World War II, occupation of Germany and of Japan, it seemed necessary. At least there was a strong case for it, both practical and moral, right? And it did work out well. And people could ask, well, why did it work out well then? This is always part of the thinking in terms of Iraq. Well, we've done it before. We, with Germany and Japan, and then but questions come up like, are there cultural differences that might make it harder to do that, et cetera, et cetera. So, not easy questions to answer. But the suggestion of just war theory is there are essential questions to consider, and that you have to do you have to at least try to leave things better than you found them, or at least not worse. Okay, so that's it for jus ad bellum and jus post bellum. We'll take up jus in bello in the next lecture. See you later.